Hello! I'm Elaine, and I'm a tour guide in the French Quarter. I do ghost tours. And I am not going to tell you the stories that I tell on my tour, because you gotta pay for those. But if you want to hear some interesting things that have happened to me while I'm leading random drunk people around the French Quarter, I got you. So it's summer right now in New Orleans, which means several things. First of all, it's hotter than the devil's taint out there. But that also means bad tips, and it means that every tour guide on the street is spending about half their time trying their best not to pass out, and the other half of the time trying their best to make sure their guests aren't passing out. And that's a problem because objectively there's not much we can do. It's not like we have an air conditioner unit we can bring with us. So it's mainly just walking slower, keeping an eye on the guests that look like they might fall down and be like, okay, we're going to find a place to sit now, and making sure everyone knows to bring water. Though it's amazing how many people will just not. But tonight was exceptionally bad for me, partially because I made a mistake. My car doesn't currently have AC because I don't have the money to fix it, and usually riding with the windows down is fine, and tonight it just wasn't enough. Like, I was so overheated by the time I got to the French Quarter. And I was like, it's fine. I'm going to stop and get a frozen beverage. And I knew that was a mistake, because the frozen beverage that I would get is a smoothie. And if there's one thing I know, it's that sweet, creamy, and overheated do not go together. But still, the thought of a frozen beverage outweighed any bad thoughts. So I went and got a smoothie, and I was literally like 2 sips in when I was going, I might puke this up later, but I'm gonna eat it. So yeah, I sat there and drank that entire smoothie, and that meant I spent the majority of my tour tonight just trying my best not to puke. But the later tour was the one that I had the real problem tonight. I had a gentleman on the tour that even before the tour started, I could tell the heat was getting to him. Like, we were literally just sitting around inside the store where there's air conditioning, and his face is covered in sweat. And he also has a towel draped around his neck that throughout the night, he'll take that towel off like 4 times and wring it out, and every time he leaves a puddle of sweat behind. But also, he just is bright red in the face. He looks knackered, for use of a British word. But as the night goes on, he looks worse and worse. And every stop we're stopping at, he is leaning against buildings, he's leaning against poles, he's leaning against cars, he's leaning against anything. And I'm not correcting him at this point, because in my mind, it's slightly better to have a guest leaning against something than to have a guest pass out. But there was one point that we were walking down another stretch that is one of the longer walks, and we just had to get passed by 3 other tours. So I wasn't really focused on the people behind me so much as getting through, until I hear someone shout behind me, "Hey, miss." And I sort of stop and look back, and sure enough, my guests have paused on the street corner and are just gathered around, and I'm like, "Y'all okay?" And they're like, "There's a medical emergency." Which, those are the words no tour guide wants to hear, because frankly, I don't really have first aid training. I can put a Band-Aid on you, I can give you some Neosporin, I can give you some Tylenol, even though I'm not supposed to, but, objectively, I'm not trained to deal with heat stroke. But I have, Googled it. But of course, I run back and I'm being like, oh my God, what's going on? And sure enough, it's the guy I've been worried about the entire night. And his wife is standing there being like, oh my God, my husband is 2 blocks back. He said he's having trouble breathing and his chest hurts. And I'm like, oh my God, that's a heart attack. And I'm like, oh God. And so immediately I'm starting to walk where she pointed, down the street, and she doesn't follow me. And I'm like, are you coming? Or should I go to him? Have you called an ambulance? And she's like, oh, he's just 2 blocks back. I'm like, okay. So I just went on. And sure enough, a couple of the other guests followed me, but she did not. She just stayed where she was and watched us go. And of course, I'm moving as quickly as I can. And I'm halfway down the block when I see him coming towards us. And of course, I'm rushing over to him and be like, are you okay? Do you need water? Do you need fanning? Do you want to borrow my fan? Do you need to sit down? Do you need me to call an ambulance? And he's like, I'm fine. I'm just overheated. I'm like, okay, still, do you need water? Do you need fanning? What can I do for you? And he's like, I'm fine. Just let me rest. I'll catch up. And meanwhile, his wife is being like, well, you said you were having trouble breathing. And he was like, yeah, because it's hot. And I could tell at that point he is more irritated with being called attention to than he is in trouble. So I'm like, okay, we're just gonna move on. And I do what every tour guide does when someone gets overheated. We move very slowly. We add a lot of little lanyards, reasons to just stop. So we're having moments where we're still instead of moving. And I also look for the few locations where people can sit. Now, there are not that many sitting locations, and a lot of times, yes, it is someone's front steps that you're sitting on, but there are places that I know good and well no one has ever been mad at us for sitting there versus places that, like, someone has called the office and complained about us sitting on their steps. So we know where there are places that someone can sit and where they can't. So I made sure that he was sitting, made sure he was, I tried to make sure he was on the side where I was fanning him, but he was on the other side, and I can't fan with my left arm, so I couldn't do that for him. But the tour ended okay, and after the tour was over, he sat there for a while, and I made sure I stayed until he left to make sure he was okay. But the kicker of this entire thing is after this woman called it a medical emergency and implied this guy was having a heart attack, after all the stress of trying to get him somewhere, like, relatively comparatively cool, after all that, he's just saying, after this tour, I'm just going to go get some water. That's all I need. And, like, I'm opening my mouth to give him directions to, like, here's a bar, there's a bar. These are all places you can get water. There's a grocery store down there. And his wife interrupts to say, or we could get some drinks. I'm like, yeah, that's the correct decision.
Don't forget to like and subscribe, and feel free to share your own experiences in the comments below.